Thank you, Roger. The church where I served in Charlotte for years, even before I came there, they had an annual West Virginia mission project where they would raise money with a big barbecue in February that would go to help support typically some sort of building effort to help struggling churches in the state of West Virginia. And for a few years, the money that was raised went to help construct what was going to be the only Baptist camp in the state. And so we would raise money in February, and then in the summertime, there would be our group and then groups from other churches from across the region that would be going up there to help do these projects. And for a couple of years, the project, again, was to build this camp. And so we had, in previous years, done the hard exterior work, so getting walls in place, getting roof put on, that type of thing. And so this one particular year, the goal was to do more finished type stuff. And so we were working on drywall and that type of thing. And one of the things that I got tasked with was that in this kitchen, they had purchased some ceiling fans. They wanted some ceiling fans in there, and they had already done the rough wiring, so the wires were there up in the ceiling. I just needed to get these things mounted, get them wired and connected. And so for the next little bit, I wired these ceiling fans. And so I had done that before and wasn't too concerned about the prospect of doing this. And so I got them hung. Everything seemed to be fine. But there was a problem, and the problem was this. Normally, after I have done something like that, I want to do something very basic. I want to flip a switch, I want to pull a cord, and I want to make sure that it works. But the problem is there was no power yet on the property. And so I wired it. I got everything as best I could. But in fact, to this day, they still may be just gathering dust. Just wonder why they won't turn. Anyway, I have no idea. And so I did what I thought was right. I went black to black, white to white. Got these wire nuts snug. I've got everything that I think I've done correctly, but I still am not sure if I've actually done it correct because I can't turn the power on. That type of experience stinks because if you've been doing what you think is right, you want some sort of way to know and some sort of feedback to let you know I actually am doing this correctly. Today we're winding down a series in the book of Daniel, where we've been looking at Daniel's life in a series that we've been calling Life in Babylon, Thriving in Opposition. And even though there's tons of time, thousands of years that separate our experience from the experience of Daniel, there are some great similarities in that Daniel was a follower of God, trying to follow the Lord in the midst of a culture that was headed in the opposite direction. That likely is something that you can say, I know exactly what that feels like. And this week at work or this week at school, I have seen repeated instances of what it's like and the pressures that I'm facing trying to live out my commitment to the Lord in the face and in the midst of a culture that's headed in the opposite direction. And so we've been thinking about a number of ways in which Daniel did some stuff wonderfully right. And God uses him as an amazing example to show us how this can happen and how this should happen. And maybe it is that God's been speaking to you and he's been showing you some stuff along the way, some adjustments that need to be made, some choices that need to be made differently, and you're left with this point. I think I'm doing, or as the weeks and months and the years unfold, I want to continue to be doing some of these things, but it would really be nice to know if I'm actually doing all of this the right way. So here's the question we want to think about today. How is it that I can tell if I am living my faith out properly? This whole following Jesus, this whole living for God, allowing him to live his life through me, how can I tell if I'm actually doing this correctly? Well, there's not a switch that you can turn on, so how can you tell? Look with me in your Bibles today to Daniel chapter 6 as we pick up the end of a story that you're likely very familiar with. Daniel chapter 6, we're going to start reading with verse 18. Just so that we're on the same page, Daniel has been tossed into the lion's den. Verse 18 says, the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he reached the tent, he cried out in anguish to Daniel. Daniel, servant of the living God, the king said, has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions? Then Daniel spoke with the king. May the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they haven't harmed me, for I was found innocent before him. And also before you, your majesty, I have not done harm. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to take Daniel out of the den. When Daniel was brought up from the den, he was found to be unharmed, for he trusted in his God. The king then gave the command, and those who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the lion's den, and they, their children, and their wives. They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to those of every people, nation, and language who live on the whole earth, "May your prosperity abound. I issue a decree that in all my royal dominion people must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God. He endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He rescues and delivers. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth, for he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Hearing that, you may say, well, I'm really familiar with this. I remember even as a kid hearing about, even drawing pictures. Maybe some of you are imagining a flannel graph with Daniel in the lion's den. You're so familiar with this. But this passage here really helps answer the question, again, that we want to think about, which is this whole experience of following the Lord in the midst of a culture that's headed in the opposite direction. How can I tell if I'm actually doing this correctly? I can't plug in. There's not a tester that I can use. There's no litmus test that I can use. How can I answer that question? How can I tell if I'm doing this correctly? Well, based on what we see here, there's some questions that we need to ask. And the answer of that to these questions will help us know whether we're in bounds or not. And the first question is this: are people aware of my commitment? Are people aware, as a follower of God, for you, if you have a relationship with the Lord in the midst of this culture headed in the opposite direction, are people aware of your commitment to the Lord? All right, so that we're on the same page, let's think about what's been going on. Daniel is not liked by some of his contemporaries because they think that he's got a position and a gig that they really wanted. And besides that, he is constantly cited as being an example, and Daniel's so wonderful, he's so dependable, he's all these things, and they really grew to resent him. And so they decided, we need some way to get rid of him, and the plan was, we're going to force him to choose between obeying God and obeying the king. So they go to the king and say, "Your Majesty, you are so wonderful. We think everybody needs to confirm that. And so for the next 30 days, you should issue a law that for that period of time that no one can bow down, pray to, or worship anything except you, because you're so great." And the king hears that and he's like, "You're right. It's a really good law. We ought to have one of those. It's a lot better than the do not call list. That doesn't work anyway. Just pray to me." And so he signs the law, knowing that it can't be changed. As soon as that happens, Daniel's enemies start lurking around his place because they know it's going to happen. And they discover out of the gate that it's not just a time, but in the first day, 3 times, he's praying to the Lord, because that's what Daniel does. He's committed to God. He knows what the law is, but he also knows who God is. And he decides, you know what? I'm not doing what the king said, because that contradicts what God has said. Which he said, "You'll have no other gods before me." And that includes this king that says I ought to pray to him. I'm not doing that. And so they go back to the king and they say, "Oh, by the way, Your Majesty, this is a great law that you've done, but that Daniel guy, one of these, you keep talking about him. Just want you to know, this whole law thing that you passed that, it can't be changed, he's been breaking that. And I believe, let me see, I think you said if somebody disobeys or breaks that law, they get tossed in the lion's den. Isn't that correct?" Well, yes. And the law can't be changed, right? Correct. At this point, the king, he tries to figure out a way to get out of it, but he can't. And so Darius issues the order that Daniel be tossed into the lion's den. And that's where we last left it. And we're told in verse 18 that the king goes to his palace. He spent the night fasting. This is a guy that he can't sleep. And he's concerned because he really cares for Daniel. And he loathes the fact that he's been fenced in and painted into a corner here. And he's really concerned about what has become his friend. Verse 19 says that at first light of dawn, so the moment that it's light enough to go out, the king, and you got to think likely there's a caravan, they come down to the den. And this den has been sealed. So imagine that there is this pit in the ground that Daniel has been tossed into, where there are these lions. We're told in verse 17 that there was a stone that was brought in to cover that, so there's no escape route. It has been sealed and marked with the king's signet ring, so that if anyone would have disturbed this, it would have been evident. And so they come they move the stone back, they break the seal, and you see that the king asks a question. Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the den of lions? So easily you can just be cruising through this and you say, okay, he's checking on his friend. But isn't it interesting that Darius, who is not a follower of God, this is not somebody that at this point has his own personal relationship with God. This is not somebody who had to stop praying to God to start praying to himself. Notice his question. He doesn't say, hey, Daniel, are you okay? He doesn't say, is anybody down there? Isn't that what you would ask? I mean, if this stone has just been rolled away, wouldn't you say, hey, Daniel, are you there? But look at his question. He says, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the den of lions? Isn't that an interesting question? That question tells us something about Daniel, doesn't it? It tells us that Daniel is a guy who is operating in a culture that's headed that way, but he's still following God. And the people around him, they know it. They know it. You've heard me say this time and again, and it bears repeating, because it is the case that your relationship with God absolutely is deeply and meaningfully personal. It is. While it is personal, it is not private. The life that I am called to live and the life that you are called to live as a follower of God in this culture or in Daniel's culture at any point in time is one that should be lived out in such a way that the people who are around you, that have proximity in your life, and they're able to see how you operate and to hear the things that you say and to hear of your worldview and to hear what it is that you accept to be true. Those are people that ought to realize, hey, that's somebody, that's a man or a woman, that's a teenager, that's someone who has a relationship with the Lord. Listen, we are operating again in a culture that's very much like Daniel's, going the opposite direction. How can you tell if you're doing this living for the Lord the way that you should? Ask yourself very simply this. Ask God to help you answer this question. Are people around you, are they able and do they know of your commitment to the Lord? It's likely at various points that you've had a little episode or plain word association where somebody says something and then you come up with or you share what it is that comes to mind. I don't want you to give me your answer. I just want you to think of your answer to these word association things, all right? All right, a good hamburger. You got that? A bad hamburger. You got that? A good-looking man. An ugly man. A beautiful woman. An ugly woman. I'm going to stop you for a second. An honest politician. A committed Christian. You know, in each of these scenarios, in each of those, it's likely that someone, in fact, I would argue it's almost certain that at each instance there is someone's face that came to mind. Whether you knew them really well or not so well, when you hear that phrase, whatever it was, there's something, someone that comes to mind. Listen, I'm not suggesting that you or I or any of us as followers of God that we're doing this perfectly. I'm not, you're not, none of us is. We're still screw-ups, saved by God, saved by His amazing grace, but we still mess up. We still do. I get that. But it should be that there ought to be somebody, there ought to be some people that when posed with a question, can you think of a committed follower of God, that your face ought to come to their mind. That doesn't mean that they think you're the next Billy Graham. It doesn't mean that they think that you're perfect, but it is that they know that you are someone who has a relationship with God and you're serious about that. This is not just a game. This is not just perfunctory exercise that you're going through, but this whole experience of following Jesus, you are serious about that. If you want to know if you're doing this how you should, ask yourself. Ask God to help you answer this question. Are people aware of your commitment to Him? There's another question we need to ask, and that's this. Have people been pointed to the Lord? So have people been pointed to the Lord? So the king has gone to find out if Daniel is okay. And you can imagine the sigh of relief that he breathes when he hears Daniel say, hey. I mean, he's had a complete, I've got to think he didn't sleep at all. He's tossing and turning. He's trying to figure out maybe is there some way that this could have been changed, something I could have done, is there anything that I can do? And so he is so deeply concerned about what has happened to Daniel. And so he's so relieved finally to hear Daniel's voice. And Daniel says in verse 21, I guess this is how you operate under a monarchy. So he starts by saying, may the king live forever. So that's like a God save the queen, God save the king type of statement. And then he says in verse 22, my God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they haven't harmed me. It is always important to pay attention to what is said, and in paying attention to what is said, to note what is not said. Because not only is what is communicated true and significant, the opposite, I believe, is also true. Because, pay attention to this, Daniel does not say, it's a tough night. I'm telling you, Your Majesty, the entire night, I was like, my cat-like reflexes. I found a stick over in the corner. I dared one of them to come after me. They'd roar at me and I'd scream back. You like that, didn't you? There are 1,000 different ways that Daniel could have communicated to the king, hey, somehow, some way, I got through this. I mean, it was to this corner, to that corner. I was hollering. I was trying to make myself really big. I did all of this stuff, and man, what a long night. But thank goodness I got through this. And each of those things that Daniel could have said, and each of those ways he could have responded, that would have done what? It would have drawn attention to his ability, to his deftness, to his creativity, to his courage, to his stamina, to his fortitude, to his anything. But does Daniel do that? No, he doesn't do that at all. When the king says, Daniel, are you okay? He says, my God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they haven't harmed me. So he's saying, yes, I am here today, and what I have experienced is why. This is because of what God did. Daniel's story is a story of him walking with God and then God working in his life. And people like Darius and all these people around him, they needed to hear that. Listen, in your workplace, in your school environment, in your neighborhood, if you have a relationship with the Lord and you take that seriously, He's at work in your life. And I'm telling you, people need to hear those stories. They need to hear about what God has done. And very easily, and so many times just by our silence, we can allow people to think that we are so wonderful. I just don't know how they do that. I don't know how they lost that loved one and still I don't know how they keep going on. They get that diagnosis, and I just don't see how they get up in the morning and still face the day with a smile on their face. How in the world do they do that? People ought to know that the way that you're able to do that is because of your relationship with the Lord. Because you are pointing them to Him. Daniel doesn't say, man, it was tough. Did a whole lot of roaring, running, jabbing. No, he said, God did this. God did this. I told you before that I keep a file called Stuff I Want to Remember, and it's a file I keep on my computer that I don't know, and some of them are in fact most of them are inconsequential, but little things about the kids and their experience that I want to remember. And there's all kinds of stuff in there, some of it again more significant than others, but there's a story that I recorded that occurred. Nathan was either in kindergarten or first grade, because at that point he was in public school, that we'd not started doing homeschool, and I'm not sure if Catherine was even born yet at that point. I guess maybe she was. I haven't done the math. But anyway, Caroline at that point was going, Lawndale Baptist had a MOPS, which is a mother of preschool children's program. I think it was once a month is how often she would go. And thankfully, we're blessed. We've got a MOPS group that's meeting here weekly. And so every Tuesday that happens. But anyway, back in the day, Caroline was going to this group on Tuesday. And typically what I would do is I would take Nathan to school. And so I had taken him to school. And Caroline calls me because she realizes she's supposed to take some sort of sweet treat of some sort to this, and she hasn't done this. And so she needs me to stop by Donut World and to pick up some apple fritters. If you haven't been to Donut World and got an apple fritter, do yourself a favor. Go to Donut World and get an apple fritter. They really are. They're good. And so I bring, before you even come to church, I go get the apple fritters. I take those home. Caroline takes them out of the box, cuts them up, puts them on some dish. She takes them. What she didn't know at this point that at that, apparently every time what they do is they vote for the winner of the sweet treat. Who brought the best sweet treat? Well, on that day, Caroline brought the best sweet treat. And so what you have to do is, if you win, you're supposed to share your recipe. So Caroline is in a dilemma, and so this is the recipe she supplied. 1 cup hazelnut coffee, 1 tablespoon sugar, 1 clock, 4 children, 1 phone. Make coffee, add sugar, drink coffee while hot if possible. Look at clock and realize it is impossible to have anything decent ready for MOPS. Consider all combinations of goldfish, fruit roll-ups, and canned chicken. Call husband, locate his whereabouts, confirm Donut World proximity. Beg him to drop 5 apple fritters by the house, happily accept the 4 that he thought you asked for. Cut apple fritters into bite-sized pieces and place them in serving dish. Throw away Donut World box. Test 1 piece for quality control. Happily attend MOPS without stress. What was she doing? I mean, she was giving credit where credit was due. This wasn't hers. This wasn't the story about her culinary masterpiece. This was the story of Donut World and their really delicious apple fritters. Listen, very easily, at school, at work, even in family situations, we can allow ourselves to get credit for stuff that God is doing in our lives. And the people around us, they need to see regular examples of God at work in people's lives so that they can see not only are you not going with the drift of culture, but you are standing in the face of that opposition and things are still going well. Why? Because the God who is at work in your life. People need those stories. And so you need to ask yourself, in fact, prayerfully ask yourself, have people been pointed to the Lord? There's a final question that you need to ask, and that's this. Have people been confronted with the truth? Have people been confronted with the truth? Notice Daniel's response in verse 22, as he's giving God credit for delivering him. He says, my God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth. They haven't harmed me, for I was found innocent before him. So God knew I had done nothing wrong. That's why he worked. That's why he saved me. That's why he shut these lions' mouths. And also before your majesty, I have not done harm. What is he doing? He is letting and reminding the king of the truth, which is that he has culpability in this. That he wound up in this pit because of the king's order, ultimately. God spared him, God saved him because God knew he had done nothing wrong. And he even says to the king, you knew I did nothing wrong, but I still spent last night down in this hole with all of these lions. What is he doing? He is letting the king know and reminding him of the truth. Unfortunately, it is the case, and it seems as though it's getting worse, but we are increasingly operating in a culture that doesn't want to hear the truth. Increasingly it is, we find ourselves surrounded by people that all they want to do is to hear how wonderful they are and how smart they are and how everything is just going great. And any decision that they make, regardless of what that decision is, regardless of that choice is, they need to be surrounded by people that do nothing but cheer and affirm and say, hallelujah, that is so wonderful. That's you being you. That's your authentic self. That's all of these things. And we're going to keep praising you regardless of what those choices are. They don't want to hear. They're not interested in anybody speaking truth into those circumstances. But the reality is, contrary to what the song says, what the world doesn't need more of is love, sweet love. What they need more of is truth, blessed truth. Years ago at our church in Charlotte, we had a sweet little lady. Her name was Annie Lee, and she had... It seemed like it was on a Wednesday. I don't know. I remember that. But long story short, Annie Lee had a splitting headache, and then wouldn't respond to the phone. Neighbor goes over there. They call an ambulance. She's had a massive stroke. They get her to the hospital, and they start doing a whole series of tests, and it's determined fairly quickly that this was a completely devastating stroke. There's no recovery from this massive brain bleed that has left her brain dead now. And so I remember being in the neuro ICU with her son and with her sister. And Annie Lee is laying there in the bed, and she's connected to a whole lot of IV tubes and wires and stuff going in, but she's on a ventilator as well, so it's doing all the breathing for her. And so technically she is still alive, but it's a very mechanical function. Annie Lee is gone. She's brain dead. And I knew that the doctors had been having conversations with the family to say, hey, it's up to you. Do we continue this or not? And I'll never forget that the sister, even though Annie Lee's son wanted to discontinue life support, as all good children want to with their parents, even though the son wanted to discontinue this life support, and reasonably so, he wouldn't, because he didn't want to overrule his aunt, Annie Lee's sister. And Annie Lee's sister said this, I don't want to do that because I want her to have a natural death. I want her to have a natural death. And I remember saying to her, it's not natural, actually, to be connected to all of this. It's just not. And so I can't make you make a decision, but I want you to know that these machines aren't natural. This has been introduced. And if you allow them to be removed, she could have a natural and peaceful passing. You know what she needed? She needed somebody just to speak the truth. Say, this is how it is. Because in her mind, that made sense. In her mind, this was a reasonable supposition that if I don't do something, then things are going to happen just naturally on their own. But she needed somebody just to say, this is how it actually is. You know, the reality is that there are people in your workplace, there are people in your classrooms that you share hallways with, maybe even that you share a home with, that you share space in a neighborhood with, that are operating on what they believe to be completely reasonable, logical suppositions that are completely, absolutely wrong. And I'm not saying that the admonition is not to walk around and wagging your finger at everybody and say, shame, shame, everybody knows your name. But as God provides you opportunity, as He gives you occasion to have conversation with them, realize that people need truth. Objective truth. This is how it actually is. Not because I say it, but because the one who made everything says it. The people around Daniel knew this is a guy that has a relationship with the Lord, and he's serious about that. He didn't have to beat him over the head. They just knew it. They were aware of his commitment. Beyond that, he was intentional in giving God credit for what God was doing in his life. Instead of taking claim for himself and celebrating his accomplishments, the attention was directed to the Lord. And as he did this, he shared with people the truth. This is how things actually are. So we can look back and say, I believe this. Daniel wasn't perfect, but this whole idea of living out his faith to the Lord, Daniel did it right. The question is, are you? Will you bow your heads with me?